Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event, Afghanistan 3 years on, Resilience in the Face of Gender Oppression. My name's Kingsley Abbott. I'm the Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies here at the School of Advanced Study, the University of London. The 3 years in the title refers to the fact that 3 years have passed since the Taliban seized de facto power in Afghanistan, again creating what has been described as the world's most serious women's rights crisis. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan, Richard Bennett, here tonight, concluded in his recent report to the Human Rights Council just a few months ago that the Taliban's institutionalization of its system of discrimination, segregation, disrespect for human dignity, and exclusion of women and girls, and the harms that it has entrenched, should shock the conscience of humanity. The violations of the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan have been so extreme, so widespread, and so systematic that our partners here tonight, Amnesty International and the International Commission of Jurists, released a report last year saying that the violations amount to the crime against humanity of gender persecution and should be investigated as such. The UN Special Rapporteur goes even further and argues that a new crime called gender apartheid should be recognised as a crime against humanity to best capture situations like the ones being experienced by women and girls in Afghanistan. And yet, despite all of this, the situation has largely disappeared from the news, overtaken by other crises in other parts of the world. Which brings us to tonight's event, which is a small contribution towards keeping what's happening in Afghanistan in the minds and on the agenda of the public and the international community, including the 56 nations of the Commonwealth. And it's very much part of the Institute's ongoing work on the rights of women. To tell the stories of the women and girls of Afghanistan and to help us think about the ways forward, including regarding justice, accountability, redress for victims, but also with respect to solidarity and protection, we are honoured to have present with us tonight a number of leading voices. Zahra Joya, an Afghan journalist who has won numerous awards for her journalism reporting on the stories of Afghan women and founder of Rukhshana Media. Sir Laurie Bristow, the former British ambassador to Afghanistan, who was in post at the time the Taliban returned to de facto power 3 years ago. Richard Bennett, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan and visiting fellow with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute in Sweden. And Amy Ferris-Rotman, Global News Editor at New Lines magazine, who has written extensively on Afghanistan, including on the plight of women and girls, who will lead us in tonight's conversation. We also have another very special guest in the room tonight who has told me that she's happy to be identified. And I'm just so honoured and delighted to have her present. And that is Manisha Talesh, who's the only Afghan breakdancer. And you may know her because she competed during the recent Olympics in Paris for the refugee team. And during her routine, she displayed the words, "Free Afghan Women," on a burqa, which she held up to the world's cameras, resulting in her prompt disqualification. Maybe Manisha can stand up. It really is so special to have your presence with us here tonight, Manisha. Thank you for coming. And Manisha will say a few words a little bit later on as well. So on that note, I just wanted to thank you all for being present and to welcome Amy and everybody up to the front. Thank you.
Lovely. Well, it's so wonderful to see so many people here, which means there's quite a lot of you who care about Afghanistan and learning about the state of Afghanistan today and what has happened in the last 3 years since the Taliban took over, especially regarding women and girls, which is, as Kingsley just mentioned, is an absolute tragedy. And we will go into that in great detail, I hope. So, just to refresh everybody, because I'm sure everyone remembers the news 3 years ago, but 3 years have passed since Kabul fell. 2 of you here were there. If we could just get a little summary from each of you on what the situation is like now. Zahra.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor for me, a pleasure to be among the 2 most, our pleasure for us to be with these 2 wonderful people, that they are deeply involved about Afghanistan issues since the Taliban took power and before, of course. And thank you so much for organizing this event. So basically, what is happening in Afghanistan is a crisis. It's a human crisis. Now 3 years past, what the Taliban ruling Afghanistan in a very harsh and brutal way. And they have lots of wrong policies against women, against all the Afghan citizens in Afghanistan. So I'm sure you have heard a lot during these 3 years about Afghanistan, what is happening there, and what the Taliban do and did for women especially, and the other marginalized groups, including Hazara community, that unfortunately it was 3 days or 4 days ago, 14 Hazara young men were killed in a brutal way in Daikundi province, in a very remote area. So since the Taliban took power, they issued so many orders, and even they reacted a new law, what they defined, it's a law that they totally forbidden women from every single steps in the public life. So in general, Afghanistan is experiencing a dark and difficult moment, I think, in the history. So thank you so much for at least being and hearing about our voice. This is really important. Thank you.
Indeed, it's been a steady erasure of women's rights and the rights of many others. Laurie, you could go next.
Thank you. So during the events that Zahra very eloquently describes, I was sitting in the airport in Kabul. We had closed the embassy by this stage. We were trying to work out what happens next. And all through that period, I was in a more or less permanent dialogue with the political military leadership back in London, as we were simply trying to answer that question. And all through that period, I was getting a feed of WhatsApp messages from our people saying, the Taliban are through the gate. President Ghani has gone. The Taliban are now in President Ghani's office. Now they're broadcasting from his office, from the same desk that he was broadcasting in a few hours before. But I'm not going to read out the entry from my diary. I'm going to read out the entry from a different diary, a different set of WhatsApp messages. So Zahra and I and a number of other people were at a book launch last night for this book. It's called My Dear Kabul, and it's a book that is built around WhatsApp exchanges between Afghan women, a writers' group, as they experienced this. So 15 August, Mariam, 11:33, Kabul. Girls, are you okay? Please let us know how you're doing. I'm worried. I'm at home. The internet is very bad. and on and on and on through the book. I really recommend that you read this for the reason I'm about to come to. So as we're discussing the politics, the geopolitics, the meaning of what happened, I think it's always worth just bringing this discussion back to the fact that this is real people. And this is real people who are still living with the consequences of the failures and the mistakes that led us to the 15th of August 2021. So I'm perpetually being asked two questions. Why did it happen? And what was it like? And I think in trying to describe, trying to talk through those two things, trying to keep the big picture, the politics around what happens next, closely linked with the personal human cost and tragedy of what happened, that seems to me to be the way to go, because it helps you answer the question, why does this matter? Why does it matter to us? And you can answer that question in any number of ways. One is, if you live in the UK and you are concerned about the UK's national security, you need to understand why, for example, badly governed or ungoverned space is used by terrorists. This was the reason we went into Afghanistan in 2001, after 9/11. If you're worried about narcotics production, heroin production, you need to understand why an economy produces those things. If you're worried about desperate people, not numbers, desperate people turning up in boats on the channel, you need to understand why they move. And behind all of this are those human stories.
Richard, if you could sum up.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. These are hard acts to follow that I'm sitting between, but I would like to begin by thanking Kingsley and other organisers at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies for hosting this evening's discussion. Last week, I was not in Kabul, I should say, on the 15th of August. I did start going to Afghanistan in 2003 and continued on and off until about March 2021. And as the Special Rapporteur appointed in April 2022, I've continued to go back. But just recently, the Taliban announced publicly that I was no longer welcome, which frankly doesn't surprise me, because my role is to make clear and accurate reports on the human rights situation, which I believe I've been doing. But last week, I had the opportunity to address the Human Rights Council in Geneva, as I do from time to time. And I said to the members of the council that there are few grounds for optimism, especially for Afghan women and girls, and that over the last 3 years, I've observed a continuing deterioration in not just the human rights situation, but the conduct as well as the rhetoric of the Taliban. Their return has led to the deliberate and orchestrated dismantling of the fragile human rights gains made over the previous 20 years. And I do want to say that there was not a golden age. There were still, during that period of the Republic, very serious human rights concerns, but there was also some progress, especially for women and girls. And the impact is on women and girls, but also more broadly on the shrinking of civic space, the treatment of minorities, and thank you, Zahra, for noting that just a week ago, 14 Hazara men were murdered on the road on their way home from another location to Daikundi. And just a week before that, there were 28 former prosecutors of the previous government blown up at a bus stop outside their workplace. These were not attacks by the Taliban. They were attacked by what Afghans call Daesh, or others called Islamic State, Khorasan province. But nevertheless, they're not protected, and their claims of security are called into question. Maybe lastly, I'll say, after August 21, there was talk that there might be a Taliban 2.0, that there might be a changed, reformed, more acceptable Taliban. Many Afghans, and some of us, did not believe that. And this is the same Taliban that ruled Afghanistan in the late 90s and the early 2000s. Same policies, actually same people in many cases. I think if there is anything positive, it's that after 3 years, that myth of a Taliban 2.0 no longer holds any water. And I don't really hear many people perpetuating that idea anymore. There is a reality. We know what the reality is. Thank you.
That's true. Thank you for that. Thank you to the three of you. I'd never thought of it that way, that at least that's been established, that people know there's no Taliban 2.0, although I still hear some people sometimes say, well, at least they haven't banned primary school yet for girls, which they did do in the 1990s. Absolutely, yeah, as if that should be an actual marker. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious that what a lot of our discussion's going to be on is women and girls, as it should be. I mean, I feel not a day seems to go by without reading or hearing about a horrific news report of violence or a case of forced marriages or a new edict which the Taliban have brought in against women and girls, restricting their movement, where they can study, what they can wear, who they can speak to. I mean, it's just absolutely all-encompassing and extremely dystopian in many ways. It's lots of people say it's like Handmaid's Tale, the novel by Margaret Atwood, and that, I think, is chillingly accurate. So, I mean, I think focusing on women and girls, and there's so much we can say here, but I mean, maybe if I turn to you first, Zahra. I mean, you're a journalist, I'm a journalist, we've done journalism together, and that's a language I understand very well. So if you could tell us a bit about how, well, first of all, how is it being an Afghan woman, female journalist today? Because I know you've got a team of female journalists working for you throughout Afghanistan who work clandestinely because of the current situation. How easy is it to be an Afghan female journalist today?
This is a very good question. I think media and independent journalists in the last year was one of the most big achievement of Afghanistan private government and the international community. Unfortunately, when the Taliban returned to power, I can say the media and the independent media and journalists is completely changed, and the majority of the experienced and senior journalists have left Afghanistan, and a few media outlets who are operating within the country is completely under the Taliban rule. So basically, the people of Afghanistan, they deprived from hearing news, positive news or something, news that directly impacted on their lives. So, for example, the people in Kabul and other provinces of Afghanistan, they cannot hear a single news about what is going on. For example, in Kabul and Dalaman, the attacks happened on the group of prosecutors, and then so the journalists were not allowed to cover that attack because it's completely, totally against the Taliban rule. So, come back to your question. as you know, Afghanistan is always was a dangerous country for journalists. But at the moment, being an independent journalist is a crime regarding the Taliban law, and being a female journalist is double crime. So because of their gender, it's never been an easy job for female journalists who are working in Afghanistan, but they are very courageous and they are very brave. So I'm proud that I work with a strong, mostly female journalist team on the ground, and we definitely need them because it's a dark moment, as I mentioned before, and the people of Afghanistan, especially women, they are under lots of pressure, as so many human rights defenders and women rights activists describe the situation of Afghanistan as a gender apartheid, that Mr. Bennett is here, and I think you're working directly with a group of Afghans. So, bringing news from inside of the country is, say, it's something like a nightmare. Yeah.
Well, that actually goes together with gender apartheid, because we don't know that the so-called gender apartheid is taking place without having news reports. So, Richard, could you tell us a bit about this campaign to have gender apartheid brought in as an actual law, an international crime against humanity? It's something I've been following very closely.
Thanks, Amy. Well, the term gender apartheid was first used by Afghan women in the late 1990s because even back then they considered that this concept best characterized, best described their experience of being oppressed by the Taliban. Then the notion went dormant for a couple of decades, and it's come back with a force in the last few years. But just on the legal side of it for a moment, it's clear that there is a political campaign to draw attention to the desperate situation of women and girls in Afghanistan through the lens of the notion of gender apartheid. But those of you who are lawyers, and maybe those who are not, may be aware that apartheid is a crime against humanity in international law, but it's defined only in terms of race. And this is because of the historic situation in South Africa. But I think some who address gender studies and address it from a feminist perspective may reflect that, in fact, the treatment of women has been underserved because there is no equally powerful law that impacts on women. Now, it's there is no law on gender apartheid. There is the possibility of creating one within a potential new international human rights treaty on crimes against humanity, which is currently being discussed in the UN in New York. And there is a campaign to have this codification, this criminalization of this issue of gender apartheid, which is not yet criminalized. It will take time. I have supported this initiative, but at the same time, I try not to let expectations get too high, because I think we know that these kinds of UN treaties take quite a while. And there are some other complications as well. But I do also want to draw attention to another crime against humanity, an existing crime against humanity of gender persecution. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court makes gender persecution a crime against humanity. There have been very, very few cases, this in 20 years, almost none. But it it does appear that the situation in Afghanistan, which is on the agenda of the criminal court, Afghanistan is under investigation, is ripe for investigation and prosecution of gender persecution. Now, there is yet another element I'd like to bring in, if I may. Afghanistan is a party to the CEDAW Convention, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Now, what we've been talking about so far, especially in the International Criminal Court, is a kind of person-to-person issue. It's individualized criminal justice. But there's also a possibility of litigating violations of CEDAW in the International Court of Justice. That would be state to state. So it would require one or more states to take Afghanistan, and there is a provision in CEDAW that could enable this, it's actually Article 29, to the International Court of Justice following an arbitration process. So this is another possibility already in international law to draw attention to the plight of the situation in Afghanistan. One final thing, because I know this will come up in a question. So would that mean recognizing the Taliban? The UN position is that the Taliban are de facto authorities, not the government, but as de facto authorities controlling the territory of Afghanistan, they are liable for the treaties to which Afghanistan is a party, and including its human rights treaties, such as CEDAW. And thank you. I'll leave it there.
No, that's fine. Like all legal things, that was very complicated, but necessary. No, but that actually, I am interested in that. By being de facto, I mean, does that mean the Taliban is obliged? I mean, could they in theory say, well, we're not going to be party to this anymore because it doesn't benefit them?
I think that would be debatable.
Okay.
Yes, they inherit the duties and the obligations of the state. I doubt that they have the authority to sign up to a new treaty or to withdraw from an existing one, but others may have views about that.
No, I mean, and that's why I want to turn to Laurie now, because as someone who, well, not anymore, but was in government for a long time, on the issue of women and girls in Afghanistan, and this is a question which, I mean, it just irks me why this has happened. But the British government and the US government were so keen at the beginning of the war in Afghanistan to support the rights of women and girls, and like Zahra said, enormous strides were made, particularly in media. Why is the UK and the US now not so keen? Where did this enthusiasm suddenly disappear to, and why? I mean, it's extremely infuriating. I'm not blaming you, but what's your viewpoint on this?
Okay, so to start with, I should, for the sake of complete clarity, say I left the government 2 years ago. I no longer work for the Foreign Office or any other form of government. I now work in academia, so I give only my own views, and it's a great liberation, I have to say, to be able to do that. So maybe the most useful thing to do here is to go back a couple of stages. So one of the things that I do in my current world is lecture right a lot on how mistakes get made. I think it's one of those things where whenever something goes wrong, it's a far more important learning opportunity than when things go right. And if we don't build that systematically into how we think about what our options are, then we're making a fundamental error. So going back to a few of the illusions that we struggled to come out from. So there is, of course, Taliban 2. I was hearing that before I went out to Kabul in 2021. It wasn't new. Personally, I could see not the remotest, not the slightest evidence to believe that the Taliban were a reformed movement. There are clearly nuances within the movement. But in terms of a fundamental change in the movement's positions on things including gender, minority, I mean, where is the evidence? Why did we believe that was the case? Because we wanted, and in some ways we needed, to believe that. Two related things. I sat in countless discussions amongst particularly the Western community, the donor community in Kabul in those 3 months before the collapse, where we wanted and needed to believe two things about our leverage over the Taliban. This was the last stages of attempts to bring them into the political negotiation that they agreed to in Mr. Trump's agreement with them, signed in Doha in February 2020. The two things that we needed to believe were that we had leverage over the Taliban, over their wish for legitimacy, and over their need for money. I came to the conclusion that the leverage worked exactly the other way round, that the leverage was on us. We believed that they needed us, that they needed to hear from us that we considered them legitimate. They didn't need to hear anything of the sort. The government that we were supporting was losing a war. Their legitimacy in their eyes came from conquest and from Allah, not from us. And I think that was a huge position of strength for them and a huge position of weakness for us. On the humanitarian side, there is no polite way of saying this. So I heard from a colleague, an international civil servant, that when he put this argument to Talibs in Doha, the argument came back, do you think I will go hungry? I think understanding that that is the nature of the regime you are dealing with, it's a great sort of liberation from illusions. So I think there's a really important set of issues in there about how leverage works when you're trying to change behavior. So moving on to where we are now. The UN, I think, has done a great piece of work. Feridun Sinirlioglu, the Turkish diplomat who wrote a roadmap towards normalization. I mean, I knew Feridun when I was in Ankara 25 years ago, a fantastic diplomat. The problem that we have not yet answered is how do you apply that leverage to the Taliban in the circumstances we now have? Most of the leverage that we had over the Taliban, we either didn't use or we wasted or we lost over a period of 20 years. We are now in a situation where they are in a position of strength and we are not. So what will work here, what will not work here? Normative approaches, I think, are very, very unlikely to change their calculations. They believe what they believe. It's different from what we believe. I think it's wrong, but that's the situation. What we need to find is a way of marshalling the international community to make them deal with choices that they don't want to deal with. It's very, very easy to say, extremely hard to do, because quite often the people paying the price of those choices are not the Taliban themselves, but the population. I mean, this is one of the things I think where we really have to face some facts that this is a country with half the population dealing with food insecurity. How do you address that without working with the Taliban, or at least not working against them? I don't know. I don't have a good answer. There's one final point, though. It's around the divisions within the movement. So I've heard, many of us have heard, that if you ask Taliban political leaders, quite often living in Doha, do your daughters go to school? Oh yes, of course they do. Why would they not? You ask the same question of the religious leaders in Kandahar, you'll get very different answers. So there's something there about trying to shift the balance within the Taliban movement, which will be very, very hard, will take an awful lot of time. My final point, though, and it's one that I use in every possible occasion. It's something that Zahra said at an event on International Women's Day in Cambridge earlier this year. If you're not educating your girls, you're not educating your boys either. This is a fast route to state failure. What do you do about that?
For sure. Because a lot of the teachers as well are women. Yes, and that does bring me back to Zahra. When you said about the Talibs who are in Qatar and who are in negotiations, say, of course my daughters are being educated. And in fact, a story I was chasing for a very long time was trying to prove which universities their daughters are at. I do have a couple of names of the universities, but it was difficult trying to actually get to that. But in terms of that, Zahra, if you could actually talk from an Afghan perspective about what these sorts of restrictions mean culturally, because if there are members of the Taliban movement who don't think women should be banned from going to school, I mean, how do these bans actually play out in Afghan culture and society? I mean, are there people that you know who think, oh, well, that's probably a good thing, or they view it as extreme?
Well, first thing we should, I mean, you know about this. Afghanistan is a very diverse country. There are living different groups, ethnicity groups. So, unfortunately, the Taliban, they claim that they are implementing the Sharia law, which is, from my perspective, which is a lie. So the problem is that the Taliban, all of them, they are belong in a very core ideology. They are following a small something like a small part of Sharia law or Islamic law, which is called Devbandi. And then, so the problem is that even in some very remote area in Afghanistan, the family are happy to provide education for their children, including the girls. So I studied, I finished my school in a very remote area. There was no a proper building for our school. We studied many years under the shadow of trees, And 2 hours walk for the children. It was not only about me, like there were hundreds of children that they had this enthusiasm to go to school to learn something new. But unfortunately, what the Taliban are doing is completely against what the people of Afghanistan want, because for example, in Hazara community, no one's, even a single family, doesn't want to deprive their children from the education right, because it's a very basic and fundamental right for human. So, I just came back from a very, I think it's the first big conference of Afghan women from Albania last week. I saw a group of mostly young generation of women that they were so powerful in their professional life. They are so active and they are ready to fight for the Taliban, honestly. So when we are seeing a completely different and a very core conflict going on in Afghanistan, I think it is really important for us to find the roots of that problems and that struggles that Afghanistan people are going through.
Thank you. We've touched on this, well, parts of what happens to the society, how it gets destroyed by what the Taliban's doing to women and girls. But I was wondering, Richard, if you could kind of give us an overview of the scale of this destruction. I mean, in terms of mental health for women, in terms of education. I mean, because we're talking about it in relatively abstract terms, but if you could, because I know that you've got lots of devastating stories and facts and figures. I mean, what does it actually mean for a country to be doing this to its women and girls?
Well, I think probably the audience here is aware of some of the examples. Best known, of course, is that women and girls above 6th grade cannot get education. They are extremely restricted in employment. They cannot play sport, and we have a sportswoman here with us. Movement is extremely difficult. and there's a requirement for full face covering type of hijab. So women are basically, many women are imprisoned in their own homes, and that's how they describe it mentally. And I talk to many Afghan women who feel that is their choice in life. And of course, they'd had very great hopes and even expectations, because they'd seen women become high-level politicians, judges, doctors, lawyers, and so especially for girls and young women, the future now looks devastatingly bleak, and there are very serious mental health consequences for that. And we're seeing increases in suicides and suicide attempts. But I'd also just maybe like to reflect on, just for a moment, on the title of the event today, Resilience in the Face of Gender Oppression. Because, with respect, I think resilience doesn't quite describe it. It's much more than resilience. Courage has been mentioned. Determination, as you, Zahra, pointed out from the meeting you went to last week. Persistence and creativity. So I think what we're seeing is leadership from women, and there's a cost to that. Zahra and I sometimes work on similar cases and in cooperation of girls and women who have paid the price for demonstrating, for their courage. And that price includes violence, and sometimes includes sexual violence as well. And those are issues that we are looking into, and we believe that there need to be accountability for. Now, I'm not sure I've answered your question very directly, but I would also like maybe wrap up with a couple of points that have been made a little. But one is about my report in June took an intersectional approach, that it's important to not just lump all women and girls or all genders, let's go beyond women and girls, all genders together, but to see how if you are a woman from an ethnic minority, Hazara or Uzbek, Turkmen, different religions, Sikh, Hindu, if you have a disability, if you are heading a household, there are more than 200,000 households in Afghanistan headed by women, then that deepens the oppression and discrimination. And you touched also on the intergenerational impact. Yes, education for boys is deteriorating as well as girls. But just think what it's going to be like when there are no positive, strong female role models outside of the home. For boys as well. It feeds on itself. And I think Laurie has also talked about the potential consequences of a poor, uneducated, except in fairly narrow religious terms, population for radicalization, and that while some in the diplomatic community might hope that they can contain the suffering within the borders of Afghanistan, I think that's far from certain. And that unless this is addressed in Afghanistan, the consequences may flow beyond the borders and even as far as Europe and the UK.
And then we'll go back to 9/11? What started this? What started Western involvement in the invasion of Afghanistan? So, Laurie, this is, sorry to give you the $1 million question, but no, but I mean, What should we be doing? I mean, what should the world at large be doing now to improve this situation?
Okay, so I have a short list. Again, they're very, very easy to say. They're much, much harder to do. So one is, it's to pick up the point that both Richard and Zahra have made. Start with the principle that addressing causes is quite often less difficult and less expensive than addressing symptoms. So if you look at the consequences of 9/11 in terms of the human costs, the financial costs, the bending out of shape of foreign policy, defense policy over 2 decades, this happened to some extent because we took our eye off the ball. Now, we know a lot more about where those kinds of threats, how those kinds of threats materialize. I mean, people who've done counterterrorism for the last 20 years have studied the link between state failure, radicalization, and safe space for violent radicals to operate in. Let us use that knowledge that we earned. Second, it's about, again, learning from the fundamental failure of that 20-year campaign. So a lot of people have seen that there was a report published by members of the Republican Party in the US last week, basically trying to say that, well, the report speaks for itself, but there's an election coming. You can guess what the report says if you haven't read it, that it was all the fault of President Biden and, of course, Kamala Harris. It's much more complex, but in a way much simpler than that. We failed for 20 years to create the conditions for US-led military to leave. But they left anyway. What conclusions do we draw from that? That, you know, unless you have serious pluralist governance in Afghanistan that is capable of running that country for the benefit of all of its citizens, we are all going to fail. But we're in a much, much weaker position, we the UK, we the West, than we were before August 2021. That's a result of mistakes that we made, all of us, over 20 years. So I think my point there is start with no illusions about why we're here and where we are. My last point, and this is, it really is the point of events like this, and you know, if you ask, what can I personally do? Listen to Afghans, especially Afghan women, talk about what they actually want. You know, this conversation has gone way beyond foreigners talking about what Afghans should want. You know, part of what we do here is to create a platform, create a space for Afghans to have that conversation for themselves, and with their international partners.
That naturally brings us to you, Zahra. What should we do? What can we do? Is it about getting women to be involved in any sort of engagement with the Taliban? I mean, a few months ago there was a big meeting with the UN and the Taliban, which Richard wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about how the Taliban didn't want any women there and the UN obliged. So what should we be doing instead?
I think Sir Laurie is highlighted very well. So first thing is we have to hear the voice of Afghan women and Afghan people, that what they are thinking and what they are doing. So give them, I think, more space. And of course, what is going on in Afghanistan is not about the people of Afghanistan. So they are, specifically women, they are reclaiming the very fundamental and basic human rights. So the second thing is there is lots of initiative led by women, especially women, because in Afghanistan, sadly, and during the history of Afghanistan, by changing every single regime in Afghanistan, women and girls are the first victims. So I think we have to change the circle, and we should find the new way, the new pathway. So I know there is lots of politics going around, but this is very important for the international community to give us at least what they can do. For example, I think the question is that what you can't do for us, you know? There are so many things that you can, but what you can't is very important for us to know, because the people of Afghanistan, they have a list of acceptation from international community, as they were involved in Afghanistan policy many years. So for last comment that I have, I think all of the audience, and also you have heard a lot from some of the people, they say the people of Afghanistan, especially the women, they exaggerating about what is going on in Afghanistan, which is not true. Afghan women are fighting for a very basic human rights. So I think they are the force for change in our society. We definitely need your support, and listen to them, give them platforms, give them space on the negotiation tables and the policymakers' tables. This is, I think, crucial points that it's very important for women in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes, I agree on all points. Give women platforms like yourself here. And just briefly, if I could ask, because on this, I mean, there seems to be this catch-22 in the international community to do with aid, because it's, at least that's how it's being framed, which is, on the one hand, if you engage with the Taliban, then it's the better of two evils, because then you'll be able to, and I'm just, I want to know, yes, what Richard thinks about this and if it's even true. But a lot of people think how this has been framed by many in the media, but also by all sorts of think tanks, is, well, there's two evils here, and the better of the two evils is to engage with the Taliban and get the aid in so fewer people die and fewer people are malnourished, versus the opposite. But my question to all of you, actually, but Richard first perhaps, is, I mean, this is a polarized view. I don't even know if it's true. I mean, to what extent is that true? That you would need engagement in order to ensure that more people survive and more people are able to live?
I mean, I think, it's necessary to provide humanitarian aid. I have never spoken against that, but there need to be guardrails to minimize the deviation of that aid into the wrong pockets, if you like. And I think that there are some benefits, certainly, that the Taliban derive from humanitarian aid going into Afghanistan, but this occurs in many repressive environments around the world. I think the amount of deviation is no greater than it is in some other countries. And actually, there is a case to be made that because of the corruption during the Republic, that just as much aid was going into the wrong hands and the wrong pockets in that period as well. So I don't think that this is necessarily, I don't think there should be an argument about withdrawing humanitarian aid. I am more concerned that the levels of humanitarian aid have been going down year by year, and they're less this year than they were last year, and I am concerned that there'll be less next year than this year. And it's the Afghan people that will suffer the most. So I'm not as concerned as some others. I think that members of the international, I hate using this word international community, but I can't think of another phrase, need to do much better, be much more transparent about what they're doing and communicate much more exactly what they're doing, because there's opaqueness on all sides. And there needs to be a lot more honesty and transparency when it comes to humanitarian aid and many other matters. But just maybe if I can just take the floor just for another minute, because I know we're wrapping up soon and looking forward to the Q&A. I couldn't agree more. This needs to be women-led, and women need to be supported. I think that it's important to understand the root causes and not to focus only on the last 3 years, nor even on the last 20 years. I think the last 45 years at least need to be taken into account. And to note that sometimes I'm asked, and this is a bit of a tension I have with some of the NATO countries, that when it comes to accountability, if one is going to be survivor or victim-centered, how can one go to have a date beyond which we don't go, and to say, let's make the Taliban accountable for what they're doing for the last 3 years, or Daesh, but let's overlook other parties to this long conflict who also have violated human rights. In the 1980s, for example, there were literally tens of thousands of disappearances of Afghans and killings that story has never been told. And I'm sometimes a bit unpopular for reminding people of that. But I think it's important to be even-handed and to treat all victims equally. Thank you.
I think that's a really good point to end on, actually. Unless our panelists have anything else to add, I think we can turn to our Q&A. Okay, let's begin with,
Manisha.
of course, Manisha, our special guest.
در اول میخوایم معذرت خواهی کنم که انگلیسی ما خیلی بد است، ولی خوشحال هستم که خودت اینجا هستی و میتونی مرا همراهی کنی. پس کم کم پیش میریم که بتونن درست ترجمانی کنن.
She says she's very happy to be here, and she feels sorry that she couldn't speak English fluently. So she is happy that I will help her.
تشکر. خیلی خوشحال هستم از اینکه مرا دعوت کردین و خیلی خوشحال هستم که با شما اینجا هستم. سوال خاصی ندارم، فقط میخوایم برای کسایی که اینجا هستن بگویم که من یک آدم هیپ هاپی هستم. طرز فکر من، طرز لباس پوشیدن من کلاً با بقیه فرق میکنه و من اهل صحبت نیستم، اهل عمل هستم و کاری را که انجام دادم هم همچین چیزی بود.
She says she doesn't have any specific question, but as she wants to say something for you, especially audience, that she is doing a hobby. What was the name of the breaking dance actually? Break dancing, and she says, as you see, her style, including and her clothes and her mindset, is everything is different, and she is not a good speaker. She is an actor person.
و اگر چیزی بخوایم برای جهانیان بگویم، او فقط 3 کلمه است که این 3 کلمه برای من خیلی با ارزش است که تو دو میتونی هم افغان پیدا کنی، هم آزادی را و هم زنه، و او free Afghan woman. Thanks.
She says she has nothing to tell more, or she just want to say a few, at least 3 words that you in that 3 words you can find Afghans, human rights and freedom. It says free Afghan woman.
Thank you so much, Manisha. So I think what we'll do now is gather a few questions. Yes. And then, so I'll write them down and then we'll take a few.
Okay. First of all, well, thank you very much for the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. This is a really great discussion, and I enjoyed everything that I heard. I just want to talk about a couple of, perhaps 2 or 3. Yes, okay. My name is Abbas Faiz. I had the privilege of working with Richard Bennett at Amnesty International. Hello, Richard. So, yes, I just wanted to talk about a couple, or perhaps 2 or 3 elephants in the room that we are not actually referring to. And I noticed that there was a question, there was a remark about what the international community can do. So those elephants are regional powers. For example, Pakistan, and then we've got Iran, we've got a number of other countries around. We've got India, for example, and nobody is talking about the involvement or lack of involvement, or like kind of, how, for example, India is really pulling the rug from under the foot of the people who want to do something about Afghanistan. Also, really, the biggest elephant is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Why is it that it is possible for this organization to just not do anything? The international community, I mean, we've got to criticize, Western governments, of course, and we will do that. We probably should do a lot more. But at the same time, I always find it really very strange that there is no pressure exerted on the OIC, Organization of Islamic Conference. And I would be very interested if the panel can actually shed some light on those elephants in the room.
Great. We'll come back to the elephants. Let's just get a couple more questions and then thank you.
Thank you. My name is Nagina. I'm the country coordinator for Afghanistan at Amnesty International UK. I had a question for the panel. I'm happy for Sir Laurie or Mr. Bennett to pick it up. My question's long, so I do apologize in advance. Given the recent increase in public appearances and visits across the different provinces by Taliban Supreme Leader Haibatullah Akhundzadeh, who had largely remained out of sight for years, what factors or actors do you believe are providing him with the confidence and security to now show such visible presence? How do these developments influence the situation for women and girls in Afghanistan? And what role can the international community play in addressing this shift in power dynamics? Thank you.
Okay. Should we take one more? Let's take one more. Thank you. And if you could.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mark Corrad. I work at the Cabinet Office, but I'm here in a completely personal capacity. I opened up Afghanistan in 2001, so I've got a bit of a track record with the place. My question is very simple. It's mostly to Laurie and to Richard. Do you think that democracy can return to Afghanistan without regime change? And if so, do you think we're in for another 20 years of turmoil?
All right, well, let's, for the first question about the regional elephants, which is an excellent question, I think, well, Richard, would you like to answer that? I mean, why aren't we having pressure from India? And then maybe Zahra can talk a bit about Pakistan as well, since you have some dealings with it.
I mean, thanks very much, Abbas, for raising, talking about the elephants. I'm sure there's many elephants we haven't managed to get to on this panel, but, let's not be afraid to address them. The region plays a very, very important role. And I think, in particular, as Muslim majority countries represented by the OIC. And I don't know if I coined this term, but I've been using it, the creeping normalization, which I have been arguing against. And the region has been doing this, and the creeping has become almost sprinting, actually, in recent times. In relation to the OIC, there have been some discussions on Afghanistan, some statements, particularly about condemning the banning of education above 6th grade for girls and women. But it has not been particularly strident or strong, I think. One or two members have expressed concern that, you know, to say colloquially, that the Taliban are giving Islam a bad name. That this is not what Islam is, and that I think that one or two have said that publicly, but relatively quietly, but that needs to be said very directly, I think, to the Taliban by the OIC and by individual countries. That I think there was also some offense taken when the Taliban themselves, their emir was called himself Al-Mu'min. For those in the room may not know that this means the leader of the Islamic world. So I think there is kind of a degree of irritation, but it's being dealt with in a very kind of polite, courteous manner without much impact. The OIC has sent 2 or 3 delegations, including delegations of ulama, including women in those delegations, but they have not managed, it seems, to make much difference or even to meet at very high levels with the Taliban. So, yeah, certainly more needs to be done from within the region. And I'll note that in the vein of creeping normalization, about 10 days ago, the OIC held a meeting in Cameroon, and the de facto foreign minister, Mr. Mutaki, attended that meeting, not in official capacity, but nevertheless he spoke at that meeting. He gave a speech. He was able to give a speech. His speech was about all of the achievements of Afghanistan on better security, stamping out corruption, stamping out narcotics, not a single word on women or girls. Yeah. And then fully a quarter of the speech was about Gaza, because I think this is actually a fair point. The Taliban are the first to point out double standards around human rights. And we are on shaky ground in that respect. It gives, human rights are not a contest. Each country is responsible for upholding its obligations, but nevertheless, the system, I think, has been weakened in recent years, and they're alive to that matter.
Are there discussions in Afghanistan about is what the Taliban are doing, is it in the name of real Islam? I mean, is that a question?
I think as Sir Bennett described very well, honestly, Pakistan was a guest house for the Taliban during the 20 years because of most of the Taliban leaders were there. So still they are receiving support from Pakistan government. So in a direct response, I can say Afghanistan has a very bad chance in terms of having that kind of neighbors countries like Iran and Pakistan, and including India. And I think they should be aware about the impact of fundamentalism, because it's right, it's correct that today Afghanistan is in this kind of conflict with fundamentalism. So it will be expanded to another countries like Iran, Pakistan. So they should be aware about the impact of this dangerous process in Afghanistan. Yeah.
Laurie, moving to you, because it was addressed to you, I believe, the question from the Amnesty from Amnesty International in the UK. And I didn't catch the name, sorry, of the man. Oh, Nagina, you're yeah, lovely. But the man, you said that a man was going around Afghanistan. Okay, sorry.
The leader of Taliban.
Sorry, I didn't catch the name at all. So your question, why has he been allowed, in your personal view, to go around and where's the international community in this?
So why is he being allowed to travel around the country? Because the Taliban control Afghanistan. I mean, let's start by dealing with the facts. What's the international community's view on this? Well, I want to pick up something I think that Richard mentioned earlier. Who is the international community? I mean, it's a thing that runs through this whole discussion. So I'm not really going to attempt to answer the question of what's happening in Afghanistan. I don't have enough visibility of that. And I think one of the problems that as policymakers we have is precisely that point. I don't speak for the UK government, but I seriously doubt that the UK government is in a position to know in detail what's happening inside Afghanistan. This is the price of what happened for us in 2021, with all of the threats and risks for the UK that follow from that. But to come back to the international community point, I think there are some really important points here. And it's going to sound horribly cynical, but this is, it's kind of diplomacy 101. I mean, it's the difference between the world as you would like it to be and the world as it is. So the situation that we have, I hope we understand that we have interests in what happens in Afghanistan. We have very, very little leverage. We have very little influence over what happens in that country. That's a consequence of our failures, our collective failures. Other people have interests too. And I don't think we've talked over the years enough about those other people, not the Europeans, the Americans, the Canadians, Pakistan, Iran, China, Russia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and so on. All around the list of countries, the people who have interests and have agency over what happens to a greater or lesser degree in Afghanistan. So, pivoting to another point. I'm a Russianist. I spend most of my time now working on the consequences of what's happening in Russia and what that means for their external behavior. The way I've taken to describing the overall geopolitical scene is it is a dumpster fire. I've never seen a mess, an interrelating set of conflicts, near conflicts, things that are interacting with each other in very difficult and dangerous ways. One of the consequences of which is that Afghanistan is nowhere near the top of the political agenda, the in-tray, but also it pushes you away from thinking seriously about that fundamental question of how diplomacy works. Who are the people who have influence in this situation? Pakistan, really hard to see how Pakistan could be a positive contributor to what's happening in Afghanistan. Pakistan looks to me like the biggest case of beware of what you wished for that I've ever seen. It's their problem, I'm afraid. I'm not sure that there is much we can do about that. Russia, almost impossible to talk to Russia about anything at the moment. Certainly not this one. Iran, I just don't know. I strongly suspect that Iran has quite a lot of agency in Afghanistan, but for other reasons it's extremely hard for the US and the West to talk to Iran, because top of our pile is the Iranian nuclear program, the missile program, and use of proxies across the broader Middle East. China's a difficult country to talk to, but it's not an impossible country to talk to. We need to be thinking about where are the alignments of interest here, and what, if anything, can we do about that. Certainly the broader Middle East, we should certainly be talking to the broader Middle East about what realistically are the options here. How do we change behavior in Afghanistan? But my final point, to pick up Mark's question, democracy. So I recently came across a phrase used by development specialists. It was getting to Denmark. So I worked on the post-conflict planning for Iraq in 2003. I was in at the end in Afghanistan. One of the things that I think whoever we are for these purposes, need to think really seriously about is what actually is the objective here? Is it to create Denmark in Afghanistan, Denmark in Iraq? Good luck with that. If we've learned nothing else from the last 20 years, I think we've learned that we're unlikely to succeed. Is it to create enough of a political settlement that foreign troops, essentially people who are seen as foreign invaders, people interfering, can safely withdraw? Sounds to me like a much better sort of interim ambition than creating Denmark in Central Asia. It may be what Afghans want, I don't know. Try asking them. But in terms of our involvement in this, I think just being very clear about what is in our interests and how that aligns or disaligns with others who may have more control, more agency than we have, that's probably a pretty good place to start.
Zahra, do you see democracy returning to Afghanistan realistically? I think if we're looking realistically in the next 20 years.
If you see the history of Afghanistan, it was full of war, full of conflict, and we definitely need time. 20 years was nothing, honestly. When you, as a society, we have to look at the history of Europe. How was, in the Second War, what happened to Europe? I think it's possible if we give them chance, give them time, enough time, and give them more attention. It is possible, honestly. The people of Afghanistan are tired from war. They are just want peace. They want real peace. So if we can work together for, as Sir Bennett mentioned, the honesty way, obviously we will find, we will rebuild Afghanistan with peace, with democracy, with freedom.
Goes back to what Rich was saying, that we should be looking at 45 years of history in terms of what people want, and to put it in that context, that this has been building up for a very long time, this desire to be out of this situation. Would you like to add anything, or shall we I think we've got time for one more question.
Perhaps another question?
Yeah, shall we do another? I see a hand in the middle.
Thank you so much. My name is I'm Ehsan Masood. I'm an editor at Nature, the Journal of Science, but I have not a very scientific question for you. To what extent do you think that the return of ISIS is influencing the behavior of the Western powers in relation to the Taliban? I mean, do they basically see the Taliban as an insurance policy against the return of ISIS?
Oh dear.
Do you want to have a go at that, or should I?
That's a very good question.
You have a go, and then I'll have and you too.
So again, this is a purely personal view. Please do not misunderstand this as a sort of proxy for the UK government view. I mean, the UK government will speak for itself on this. Is the Taliban an insurance policy against Islamic State? No, of course not. I don't see how it could conceivably be that. From my perspective, I mean, it's just worth bearing in mind what the attack on the Abbey Gate in August 2021 was all about. We saw this attack building over a number of days. We knew it was coming. We just didn't know where, we didn't know when, and we didn't know the method of attack. But the end of it, of course, was 170 dead Afghans and another 13 dead US service people in the last 2 days of the evacuation. I'm afraid that is what failure looks like. Why did Islamic State carry out that attack? It was an Islamic State operative, I think, had just been released from Parwan Detention Center at Bagram a day or so previously. My interpretation at the time that this was an attack on two groups of people. It was certainly an attack on us. It was an attack on the Taliban themselves. And of course, it was an attack on Afghans. And it was, I'm afraid, to understand that, you need to understand why people like the Islamic State operate the way they do. There was a killing of polio eradicators in the last couple of months. And we all looked at this, this is just disgusting. I mean, how could anyone pursue their political objectives by killing medical workers, inoculating children against polio. It's completely the wrong question. The answer lies in how you create so much fear and anger and disgust and demoralization that you're actually winning the psychological war. That is, I'm afraid, how these things work. Could the Western governments work with the Taliban against Islamic State? Western governments have worked with a lot of very strange and unpalatable people against fundamentally threatening terrorist organizations. I don't know whether the Western governments are working with with Taliban against ISKP. I suspect they are possibly looking at that option. But I don't think that means anything in terms of seeing the Taliban as a bulwark against ISKP. I think they're a fact of life. That we need to deal with, or we need to work out how to protect our interests. We did actually skirt over a question earlier on, which is the difference between having dealings with the Taliban and recognizing the Taliban. My own answer to that is, as I just said, the Taliban are a fact of life. They are in some sort of control of Afghanistan. You choose either to engage with them or not engage with them. Both have a price and both have potential benefits. You need to make that calculation. Should Western governments recognize them? Absolutely not.
Good. For a moment there, I thought you were going to say something else. Yes, Richard, do you have anything, or Zahra, to add on this?
I think on one small thing.
Yes.
So we should not forget that Taliban, and alongside of the other terrorist groups, were our enemy in the past 20 years. They killed many of Afghans, including our international allies. So at the moment, this is a big concern, honestly, from us as an Afghan citizen, because Afghanistan is a safe place for terrorist groups. At the moment, there is Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and the Taliban itself. They are hiring young men for their forces. And then I think that one of the very simple example, a friend of mine, he went through Australia to Afghanistan. And he told me, and the way that he was going to Afghanistan, the airplane, he saw many different people that they were not Afghan. And he said, for a moment, I got something scared that where this plane is going. And then finally he asked, where is this plane is going? And they said, yes, of course, we are going to Kabul, to Afghanistan. He said, I was worried because I saw many people that they are going to Afghanistan. They came from Somalia, they came from North Africa. So as you know, Daesh, they have a very big network globally. So I think this is very important for all of us, for international community, as we still don't know who are the international community or who is the international community. So to at least keep the border of Afghanistan safe, because we have to at least a single thing that we can do to avoid the increasing number of the Taliban, the ISIS soldiers in Afghanistan. Yeah.
Would you like to add something, or
maybe just to say that I think Ehsan's question is a really good question, and I think that there is a case to be made that Western powers might be relatively comfortable if they feel that the Taliban is controlling or keeping under control other terrorist groups within the borders of Afghanistan. When I speak to Afghans, they, including Zahra, really find this kind of unbelievable. But I think there is a case to be made that if Afghanistan is relatively secure, relatively quiet, then let them stay.
Yeah.
And I think it is a point that's made. Not one I agree with, but I think it's a fair question. But I would maybe, if I could just, end up by saying that on the previous, I think the question from Mark that Laurie responded to, I think it's very important for Afghans to decide on their own future. And in this regard, I come to know Feridun Sanioğlu more recently. I met him several times in the last couple of years. I think that the report that he was requested to write and which he delivered to the Security Council had some strong elements. It emphasized the need to move towards an intra-Afghan dialogue. And from a human rights point of view, he did highlight women's rights and human rights. And he recommended that before there can be any recognition of the Taliban, there must be measurable benchmarks against which there is evidence that there have been improvements and that they've been achieved. So I think it's somewhat disappointing that even though that report resulted in a Security Council resolution calling for a number of steps, including the appointment of a special envoy, that there's been little movement on that. It was, I think, the international community has not had a vision for 3 years. It has not had coherence. It lacks a plan. Everything that the Taliban has. All of those things. They have a vision, an ideology, a plan, internal coherence. And that report was the seeds, I would say, of something. It got a bit of momentum, but that momentum seems to have been lost in the last 8 or 9 months. So I hope that it can be regained.
Great. They've also got time, unfortunately, right? The Taliban, the greatest weapon. But yeah, great. Well, I think that's it. So thank you to our wonderful panel, to Zahra, Richard and Laurie, and Kingsley for having us here. And thank all of you as well, and Manisha. And yes, I hope this means there will be lots more discussions on Afghanistan and hearing what Afghans and others working on Afghanistan have to say. So thank you.
And just on behalf of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, a big thank you to all of you being here tonight and to our speakers. I think that was a really important conversation. I think that the violations that are taking place in Afghanistan are well known and have been well documented, including the creeping normalization. But I just wanted to I think, draw attention to something that really leapt out to me in this conversation, and that was, referring to the title of the event as the resilience of women and girls in the face of gender oppression, that we're also witnessing the words used were courage, determination, creativity, and leadership. And that in terms of the way forward, I think what really came through and which was highlighted, that there is this lack of vision, this lack of plan, and what needs to be done at its heart or at its centre is to listen to Afghans, to listen to the women and girls of Afghanistan, to ask them what they want, to centre them in policy solutions, to centre them in terms of developing a vision and the way forward, but also to be careful with expectations. And I think that really leapt out at me too, which was, Afghans want to know what the world, the international community, the West, the region can do and what can't it do. There needs to be some meaningful consultation, some transparency, and I think what that gives Afghans, from what I heard and what I took from the speakers, is some kind of agency in terms of we know where we stand, we know what we can expect, we know what we can't expect, and I think that's really incredibly important looking forward to the next 20 years and beyond. So just to finish, I wanted to thank again our speakers, of course, to also thank our partners, the International Commission of Jurists and Amnesty International, which is well represented here. The Institute actually has a long relationship with Amnesty International. Our master's program that we continue to teach, which is a practice-oriented master's in human rights, actually began nearly 30 years ago with Amnesty International. So it's really great that we're here again tonight in that relationship. I also want to thank the team of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, in particular Jane and Kay, because obviously there's always a lot of work that goes behind this event. So thank you for your support. And to Manisha, so wonderful to have you here tonight, such an unexpected and important contribution. And I think maybe we just finish the event with your words, which is free Afghan women. Thank you.